Welcome to Hot Topics when medical conditions impact work. There's a lot of different ways that people are impacted. Organizations, workflow, delivery, but the reality is all of us will be impacted in some way at some time, whether it's you or your employees. So let's get into it. Welcome, Felicia, Amenta. So glad to have you here today.
Wonderful. It's my pleasure, Debra.
Great. As always, we always plan an agenda of topics that we're going to talk about. So let me just run through them really quickly. One, let's take a look at what is sedentary work versus heavy work. And these are words that we see a lot in medical reports. Let's take a look what the Department of Labor has to say about that. And then what to do when temporary accommodations become long-term. This can be shocking for both the employer and the employee. And recently have had some employee backlash, and I'll share a little more about that. And then 3 steps to take in scheduling an IPM. And so I do have a checklist that we're going to be sharing with you and how to ensure successful outcomes. And then number 4, what does a 60-day timeline really mean? How to manage the notice of offer required workers' comp before it costs you $6,000 when not necessary. We just had this come up this week. And lastly, who's on, who's off. This is a great time to take a look at what employees are actually experiencing medical conditions and where are they in terms of the different leaves and all that kind of stuff. So that's what we're going to talk about today, and let's get going on it. Number 1, what is sedentary work versus heavy work? And Felicia, just a warm up as I share my documents here. What's your experience with these terms?
So it's very interesting because I get a lot of questions about these terms because a lot of physicians use these terms. And I don't even know that a lot of our treating physicians know about what the U.S. Department of Labor definitions of these terms are. They use heavy work, light work, sedentary work. And I know in a physician's mind, they think of sedentary work. Sit down only. That's what a lot of people think. That's not actually the definition of sedentary work. They think of light work. They don't even attach lifting limitations to that. All of these definitions have very specific parameters. And when I think back in workers' comp, when I started doing it many years ago, these terms used to be rateable. Work restrictions were rateable for permanent disability. That's where this comes from. That's where this U.S. Department of Labor definitions comes from. We do not use these terms anymore for rateable permanent disability. In the AMA guidelines, it's all very objective, loss of motion measurements and surgical outcomes and things like that. But in past years, this was how people got rated for their settlements.
It's always good to tap back into history, where things come from. And I know for myself, being in vocational rehabilitation in my early career and having been trained and performed hundreds and hundreds of job analyses, these are definitely terms that we use. And so not only are these important to understand and learn, but there's another layer that when our viewers see our checklist here, I oftentimes am explaining what does intermittent mean, what does rarely mean, what does occasional mean, what does frequently mean, and so forth. Because these are also terms that are used in the world of analyzing jobs. And so if we know and understand that, then we have a better understanding of predictability. And so I'm going to just show this real quickly, and because this will be a link in the recording that we take out, or that our participants will receive, so that they actually have access to this document. And as we can see here, sedentary work, exerting up to 10 pounds occasionally. What is occasionally? Third of the day, and so on. And so you can see how it's broken out. Lifting or light work is 20 pounds occasionally. Then we get into moving down, we get into medium work, 20 to 50 pounds, and then heavy work, 50 to 100 pounds, and then very heavy work is in excess of 100 pounds. Now, I have seen this change over time too, where heavy work is oftentimes up to 50 pounds. And actually there are some differences gender-wise, so 35 to 50 pounds is oftentimes considered heavy work. But these are guides. These are guides that we can share and use and at least put some numbers to, making it more objective.
And you can see why a lot of physicians say that sedentary work is sit-down work only. one of the parameters, one of them of the multiple things that they have under sedentary work, including lifting and pushing and pulling restrictions, is sitting work involves sitting most of the time with walking or standing brief periods of time, occasional that 1/3 of the day, as you spoke of. So that's why they say it's a sit down job, because it's mostly a sit down job, but it is not a sit down only job. And because obviously you have to get up for personal conveniences and for breaks and for lunch and things like that. So sit down only was never the correct definition of sedentary work. It's just the thing that people pulled from.
And as we have now learned, sitting is actually one of our greatest health hazards in this world. And so I've even heard that it's greater than smoking. We need to get up. Mobility is critical of the older we get. And so that's where the sit-stand workstations are so powerful. And then making sure that employees are using them, because over time, your body will take the toll for that prolonged sitting.
And that is why when people are doing temporary accommodated duty, I typically will use modified duty rather than light duty. The reason why I don't like light duty is when you look at light work is exerting 20 pounds of force and has all kinds of parameters. It's one of the definitions of work. It's not really, light duty isn't really a proper term, right? Modified duty, I think, or temporary transitional duty is better description of what it is.
Absolutely, because again, this is where you need to take into consideration someone's work limitations, functional limitations, as I like to call it. Where are they limited functionally? And then apply that to the essential functions of the job. And they may have greater capacity. Like I was just working on an IPM summary this morning, where somebody can lift up to 30 pounds. And the job actually requires more occasionally, but they've been able to do temporary modified duty with that lifting limitation. And so to call it light duty would not be an accurate portrayal at all. Yep. Yeah. So again, it's really important that we dive deeper into these terms and really compare it again, accommodations around the essential functions of the job and an employee's particular functional limitations, and temporary or long-term. And so again, we've got definitions out there, it's a matter of using them.
And I still think a lot of times the physicians get confused, and I think it's better than for them to use a blanket definition. It's better for them to give more specifics. What are the lifting limitations? What are the pounds? What is the sitting and standing time periods? If they don't know what the actual definitions are, rather than throwing a word around like light work or sedentary work or heavy work, I think it's better to outline the specific parameters, the work restrictions.
Absolutely. Moving on, what to do when temporary limitations and accommodations become long-term and the employee backlash that can happen. Again, Felicia, I'd like to have you kick off because you see a lot more cases than I do, but I see a lot of cases too. And I have
we've seen quite a few recently, and the one that comes to my mind is this is a custodian and multiple body parts, but mostly both upper extremities, multiple surgeries for the multiple body parts over time. And the case got quite confusing because there wasn't one date of injury, and each date of injury had some different body parts added. So what ended up happening was there was intermittent periods of time off. There was periods of time off work completely following surgeries, and then back to work on temporary light duty, followed by periods of time completely off work again, followed by periods of light duty. Finally, the treating doctor made this employee permanent and stationary with permanent work restrictions, quite a few of them. No bilateral repetitive hand motions, 50 minutes per hour, no bilateral gripping, grasping, may lift and carry, push and pull no more than 25 pounds, occasionally up to 50 pounds. And that was the primary treating physician. And then there was an orthopedist who treated one body part and did surgery on one body part. When there was concern about the ability to accommodate permanently the work restrictions, then this employee went to the orthopedist and got a full release to return to work without any work restrictions, with no explanation or description at all. And then that was really challenging for the district, for the employer to try to figure out what to do now with completely opposing medical opinions.
Yeah, involved in that case, so I know that one well. And so this is where it's so important then is, okay, who's treating what? when you have multiple conditions. And like you said, it was learned later that the orthopedic surgeon who released her to full duty was only releasing her for one particular part of her body. All the other limitations still applied. And that's the other thing to keep in mind, is that particularly if you have an employee who's had prior injuries, is that it doesn't mean if they get a release to return to work, it doesn't mean the prior limitations don't still apply. So
Right.
don't rule those out. Yeah. And the other thing about that particular situation, it was also driven somewhat because there was a change in workplace practices, and that they reorganized the custodial department and they created a rover position to cover when others were off, and which meant that this employee got moved to a night position than a day position, which was not her desire. So it's okay, where's all this coming from? And not that she didn't have legitimate injuries. Like you said, she kept getting released back to work and then only to be off again 2 or 3 weeks later. And so that's in and out. And so again, very important to look at the pattern and again, take into consideration the multiple injuries, the multiple limitations, and the whole picture, the big picture look. And that's why we're an IPM can become so valuable to get all that information out on the table, close communication with the administrator managing the claims, because sometimes we don't know all the information that we need to know.
Well, I think especially because the healthcare system can be very complicated to navigate, especially when there's multiple physicians treating different dates of injury with multiple body parts. And then the workers' comp system is very complicated to navigate. And so trying to wrap your arms around all of the information that you need to have to make the best decision, right? Out accommodation is really important.
Yeah, and that's where the federal and state law, ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, and FEHA, Fair Employment Housing Act, come into play. And that's why they call it the interactive process. It's a very specific term to those two laws. It also applies to some other aspects that impact employment, but that's why it's interactive. It's learning and exchanging information from one another about where all this fits in. As I always like to say, it's about having a conversation, not a conversation. So
I had such an interesting question yesterday from a school district employer because their employee wanted an agenda for the IPM. They wanted to know exactly what was going to be discussed and what was going to be the outcome of the IPM. And I said, this is contradictory to the whole interactive part of the process. We haven't even gotten your feedback or had a chance to talk with the supervisor management about their feedback. And we won't know where we're going to go until we have the meeting and have the discussion. So that's why we don't have formalized agendas for IPMs for that reason. And it's a confidential process. So we're really going to discuss those things in the confidential process. We're not going to start out with an agendized item.
Yeah. And yet, having said that, leads right into our next topic is about how to prepare for an IPM. And the interactive process is actually a form of mediation. It's just an alternative, not really conflict, so to speak, but there are issues to be resolved. And so there is a structure, like with any mediation, to the process. And that's what I have a colleague calls the welcome pack to the IPM, in terms of here's what you can expect as far as how the meeting is going to be structured. So there is a structure to the meeting, but that's where it customizes then to whatever the individual is presenting, and that's where it unfolds. And the medical information, because that's what drives the interactive process. Then the employee's input. How are they doing? How are they feeling? Then the department or the site's input becomes very important. And as part of that, then, until a dive into the essential functions of the job description may be necessary if it doesn't already emerge in the conversation so far. And then we get into, okay, now that we know the medical limitations and understand the working environment, what accommodation ideas do we have? And then that leads to a plan of action. So there's structure to the meeting that people can share with their employees, but the outcome is really driven, as you said, case by case. Everything is unique. Yeah. And
we don't know what the outcome is going to be until we have the discussion. So we can't, this person wanted an agenda and wanted to know exactly what the outcome of the meeting was going to be before it even started.
Yeah. And I remember a recent IPM I did too, is that the employer, oh yeah, we can accommodate this. And that's great, but let's have a meeting because one, it's required by law and there's consequences that could happen. But it was interesting what came out of that. We found that the employee was far more impacted than what anybody understood, because she kept her condition to herself, but she was struggling. And we were able to come up with an alternative plan of action, but we wouldn't have known that had we not had the meeting. So
I just had a meeting with a teacher, teacher at one of our schools who has a pretty significant injury, and we were talking about settlement paperwork. And in the discussion about the settlement paperwork, permanent work restrictions came up. And I said, we must have had an IPM to discuss the accommodations for your permanent work restrictions. No, she didn't have an IPM. Somehow that didn't happen. And she has no idea. They said they could, and and they have been, and her principal has been great with her, but there was no formal meeting and nobody had a discussion with her. So somehow it fell between the cracks because that should have happened. She has permanent work restrictions and she's wearing a brace permanently and struggles to work in the classroom, struggles to get down in when she's interacting with the children. Nobody ever met with her, right?
yeah, and that's what came out of my situation. I was just explaining is that, do you realize, department, that if you say you can accommodate her, this is ongoing, it's indefinite.
Permanent.
And, yeah, and so if you have a need or if this is a change where you need that person to actually fulfill all of the essential functions and she can't, then you have to live with that. Because now you have another employment kind of case. Yeah, and that's why.
Because you know what the teacher's question to me was, I'm not going to lose my job. I can continue on as I have been. And again, her permanent work restrictions were imposed over a year ago in April of 2024. So that's why I just went on and talked about, I said, I'm sure that's fine. And we just went on and talked about settlement because something got missed.
Yeah. And there can be big liabilities. And that actually comes up in one of our next questions, but I'll leave it for the next question. But anyway, for all of our viewers and listeners, I have created a checklist as far as steps to take and what to have. Some common things that you want to have ready for the IPM is, again, I have a form to give me some basic background on the employee and the nature of the condition and modified work or not. And then also providing the job description is critical, providing the most recent medical. And if you don't have medical, then, let me know, because that's something that we need to get them because medical drives the process. And then also sometimes absenteeism records are very important because if somebody is missing so much work, and this has been a chronic issue, like maybe over 2 or even 3 years, that changes the ball game. And we get into FMLA protection and the criteria there. And again, excessive absenteeism consistently does indicate that somebody's not medically able to work. So that shifts the conversation. So if absenteeism is an issue, having those absence of records is really important. Those are the 3 key kinds of things, but some basic information also. That will be part of the link in our recording to come out. So don't go away. We have more to cover. The next question that we were going to discuss is that what does that 60-day timeline really mean? And this is an interesting one because I know I've dealt with this before, but it's been so long. How do we handle that?
So many questions about the 60-day time frame. And I think it's really important when you get the permanent and stationary work restrictions from the claims examiner. It's really important. The first question I ask is, when is the 60 days due? Because there's no way that you as the employer can tell that, because it is not the day that you got those permanent work restrictions. That does not start the 60-day clock. And it is also not the day that the doctor wrote them, meaning maybe the day the employer doesn't get the whole report, they get snippet, but it's not even the date of the report. That's not the date either. It's the date the claims examiner stamped in the receipt of that report. That starts the 60-day clock. But when the employer gets it, usually we're already down the road. We don't have 60 days. We have less than that at that time. And so my very first question is always, when is the 60-day time frame due? Because whether the employer is going to do the IPM on their own or whether they're going to utilize mediation services such as yourself, the time frame still applies. And we have had so many districts that have struggled to schedule it within the 60 days and have had to pay the $6,000, even though the person never was off work. They were accommodating the whole time and they accommodated permanently, still had to pay the $6,000 retraining vouchers.
Yes. And I go back to 2 or 3 years ago where there was actually a husband and wife working for the same employer. And guess what? They both got $6,000 and they were still working. And so it's like, oh, what bonus. And a couple of things, I know a lot of employees will be off during the summer. And yet if you wait for them to come back to work, you're going to run that 60 days and you're going to end up paying them $6,000 for those training monies. And again, the laws are the laws. There are consequences when you don't follow laws. And even though your working practices may be different, you got to have a conversation.
And I think that if the person either right before the IPM or at the IPM, which you've had a few of them recently, tells everybody that they're either going to resign or retire for whatever reason, it's not a bad practice to have a discussion about making the job offer formally anyway, and then having them rejected, because that gets you out of the 60 days. Because if you have the IPM and you can't accommodate them permanently, or if they're not available to take the job, that 60 days, that $6,000 voucher is still in play. So I think it's almost better with resignations and retirements to go ahead and make the offer that you were going to, and then let them reject it. And then we don't owe the voucher. And in cases where I've had a few right now where they're subbing, so they're not working anymore, but then they sub, they either retired or did something else. And for some reason, HR didn't get the memo that they have permanent work restrictions and they can't just come in and sub any position at the district. And so that disconnect really has to be between risk and HR, or the people that do work comp and HR, so that they know exactly what everybody's doing.
Yes, there's so many things in that, but I think the bottom line is that 60-day time frame. And I'm going to give a plug to Athens administrators, because they've gotten really good as far as when they send the referral for an IPM, that they're very clear about when that 60-day time frame is. So we have that to work with, because I have a situation right now where the employee wants to put it off, but we have to make a decision. And just because she wants to put it off, we either go ahead and meet on our own. If she can't meet, she does have some personal stuff, we get that. But you still have to make a decision. If you feel you can accommodate, and you do your part. And it's really the employer has to sign the offer before that 60 days. That's
right. Even if the employee doesn't decide yet, it's always better to just make it meet on your own if they can't meet with you. And if you can accommodate, go ahead and make that offer, sign the offer at least, even if you can't convey that to them for a while.
Yeah, exactly, because it's again about the notice of offer, and then they have 30 days once they receive it to accept or reject. And again, it takes that whole liability for the $6,000 off the table, any consideration. So hopefully that clears it up for some of you out there. And then lastly, we've talked about this before, and who's on, who's off. And Felicia, what are your recommendations? And I do have a spreadsheet that I have a link. I'm not going to go ahead and show it right now, but I have a link that if people would like to use it, modify it, whatever, but it's just a way of taking a look. But what do you recommend?
I really think that I took a look at the Excel spreadsheet and I thought this is the best way, because you can track in that Excel spreadsheet and you can separate out your non-industrial disability or illness from your workers' comp if you want to, or you can just have them all in there because they're all under the ADA and FEHA. But some people like to separate the comp because they have some little different issues going on. And then you're in that spreadsheet, you're tracking leave and how long they're going to be off. And it would really help in a situation like what just happened last week. We have somebody who is off work on work comp TD. They have been off work for a long time. HR apparently somehow there was a disconnect between risk. Risk doesn't live in HR. They offered the employee summer work. The employee accepted summer work. The employee was going to sign up for was going to show up for summer work on Monday. And I said, no, the employee cannot work. Medically, not work at all. They have a note, not a temporary accommodated note, and they're off work on TTD note without a new note with something changing. Had this been on the spreadsheet that everybody would have had, HR might have known that this was the status. And so then you know what had to happen. They had to retract a job offer that they had already given. This was unfortunate. And then the employee was really upset. And we were like, the employee thought that the TTD was only for their 10-month contracted position. For some reason, didn't impact them for the summer position. And I said, no, if you're on work comp TD, you can't work at any job. You're not supposed to be working at all. That's why we're paying you not to work.
Yeah, and that's also brings up another notion about this whole who's on, who's off, is that when somebody has limitations and yet they might be working an additional, I have an employee right now who was a regular job, and that's where modified duty is provided, reached 120 days max, but he also has a second job. The same school district, he does aftercare also. We talk about the primary job, and so but we also have to take a look at, can he still do the alternative or the aftercare program? And so, we talk about the basic jobs, so like overtime or additional duties that might be outside of the usual scope are not part of the accommodation process per se. And so it's just
Not
something,
part of their contracted work, right?
yeah,
If they get it, but it's not guaranteed to them and it is not a part of their actual job. And I think that's what created the confusion in this case. This person doesn't always work in the summer because summertime work is, a lot of people want to get it, not everybody gets it. And so this person doesn't work in the summer, which means they're not contracted. They don't make any money. And you know what that means? Work comp TD doesn't apply to them in the summer because they wouldn't normally be losing any wages. Because HR offered this person work, even though this person was not available to work, and this person wanted the money for working, now you know what's going to happen. We do have to pay for work comp TD in the summer for this time period because they offered the job, because then the job they would have, had they not been hurt, they would have had income in the summer. So now we will pay for the summer wage loss. But that was just because there was a miscommunication all the way around. And that's why the school district was like, what is the fix? And I said, you apologize, say you're sorry that HR didn't understand that they were off on workers' comp, and you have to retract the summer offer. We still have to pay work comp TD 2/3 for the summer loss because they would have worked had it not been for this. And they have proof of it because they got an email offer of work.
Yeah, so that is such an excellent example of all the nuances that can come into play. And again, my encouragement for everyone out there listening to what we've covered today is that things happen. So this is where it's really breaking it down and looking at each thing and not making any preconceived notions of how this is going to go. And that goes back to what you said, Felicia, earlier, as far as what's going to be, or I know how this is going to come out. Like, reserve that perspective because let's let the meeting unfold the way it's supposed to. And then we'll come to some conclusions about what are the next steps.
And I do think that leaves are very confusing, not only just regular illness leaves and all the ed code leaves, but then you add the work comp TD 2/3 onto that with the 60 days of full paid industrial accident leave, and everything becomes very confusing. So I think it's fine to say that we need to recalculate and take a look, and we're sorry that we did this. We kind of got out ahead of ourselves, and we're going to fix it. And we're going to let you know what the fix is. I think it's perfectly okay to do that because there are a lot of miscalculations that go on between risk, payroll, and HR because of the complexity of all of this. So I think it's fine to apologize and then go back over and then figure out what the fix is.
Yeah. And if I can just go back to some basics around managing differences in the world of conflict resolution, is that when you engage an employee and they're part of solving the process and reaching the outcomes, you have not necessarily happy employee, but you don't have a disruptive employee. And so it really can mitigate further outcomes that might lead to litigation, for example. And again, it's about preserving your reputation as an employer, but also preserving the integrity and well-being of the employee. And this is so many benefits to having an interactive process. It makes a world of difference. And I've seen things turn around, even in the course. Somebody who's very contentious who, okay, now that I understand, okay, I get it.
And that's what I said. I said, if the tension level on this, you can't work in the summer, becomes that high, an IPM is also, and they said, why would we do an IPM? We don't have any work restrictions. And I said, because in the IPM, you can talk about the confidential medical condition and you can explain why HR accidentally didn't realize that they were off on workers' comp because they didn't have the Excel spreadsheet available. And they accidentally offered a job that they shouldn't have, that the person wasn't capable of doing because medically they're not able to work right now. So you could explain things better, how the mistake occurred, and you could do that in a confidential process. You wouldn't have to do an IPM to resolve that, but that would be a way that you could have that conversation confidentially, right?
Yes, yes. And if I may just take this opportunity with what you've said, Felicia, is to talk about the pre-IPM consultation. And that it's always been that if you want to talk 10, 15 minutes ahead of time just to review things, great, that's part of the flat rate. If it's a more extensive, complicated kind of thing that we have multiple parties involved and HR and risk come together or whatever, then that's better scheduled ahead of the IPM. And then that does cost because there's more time on the facilitator's part. And that's in the world of mediation in general.
Yeah.
It's just, but that's a great way. Should we or should we not? Let's talk about it. I just got a request for a fitness for duty, but it's on multiple factors. I need more information before I can make suggestions about what might be the best evaluator. And we might even need to have a couple of evaluators and more information. So that'll call us up for next week. So that's the value of having that pre-IPM consultation.
I think the pre-IPM meeting is also really good because yes, Athens sends a referral form to you with the basic information about the claim and the work restrictions they have at the time. But because things aren't static, things roll on and they might have more appointments and there might be more notes. And so sometimes the pre-IPM, sometimes employer says, I've got these other two notes that you might not have because Athens may not have them or you didn't get them at the time of the referral. So I think sometimes the pre-IPM is a good time to review. Do we have all, if there's multiple doctors' notes there, do we have them all and are we clear on what they all say?
Yeah, yeah. So again, trying to continue to evolve with best practices, provide our school districts and other employers that we work with the tools and information they need to really do the best that they can for their employees without conditions when they impact work and to avoid some of the financial consequences of when we don't do it right. Felicia, thank you so much for all of your input today. And I hope this has been a learning experience for all of our listeners and viewers. And again, with the recording, you're going to be getting some documents that you can use to your avail. And again, just trying to make the process better.
My pleasure, Debra, and happy summer to everyone.
Yes, happy summer to everyone. And a reminder, we're dark in July and we'll resume in August. So enjoy and we'll see you soon. Bye.